So a Christian, a Jew, and a Muslim walk into a podcast, and they talk about how those different communities have been trying to get along in the United States and how critical social justice ideology is threatening what progress they've made. And beyond the progress that those groups have made, also the very fabric of liberal society. And while there may be some punchlines in this particular podcast, the content is no joke. Introducing David Bernstein and Suhail Khan.
Fortunately, my hair is not doing well here.
I don't have the budget to fix that in post.
Oh, okay.
We're just going to have to roll with it. So, are you guys connected or through?
You're Suhail.
Go ahead, David.
Oh, how are we connected? Was that the question?
Yep.
Okay. So Suhail and I both are part of a Muslim-Jewish dialogue or institute. It's called IJMA. It's the Inter-Muslim-Jewish Alliance. We're both on the executive committee of that. We're both been affiliated with Muslim and Jewish organizations. I was, until about 2 months ago, the CEO of a national Jewish advocacy organization. I think we've probably both been doing Muslim-Jewish dialogue for a long time. And we both have some interesting and similar insights into how critical social justice plays into dialogue and how it might actually interfere with our ability to do authentic dialogue with each other and build relations between our two communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And are you, is this Inter-Muslim Jewish Alliance, is this focused mostly in America, or is it international, or what is the purview of this alliance?
It's American, and we focus, primarily on issues with the American Muslim and Jewish communities. Of course, one of the, elephants in the room in that conversation is always the Arab-Israeli conflict. So it has that international dimension. But the challenges that we are discussing as part of this dialogue are primarily American challenges of, the BDS movement, the cancel culture. What are the terms of those conversations? We have the generational divides both between the American and the Jewish, American Jewish and the Muslim communities. We're interestingly and probably not surprisingly, younger American Jews and Muslims are much more hardline when it comes to the terms of those dialogues, and so it seems like the older community members are the more open. So it's kind of counterintuitive in that way, but that's some of the. And then one thing that's very unique about our dialogue, because there are other efforts between the Jewish and the Muslim communities, is that we specifically aim to tackle the more difficult issues rather than kind of sidestepping those. So that's one of the reasons why we're coming to you today, is because we want to talk about the tougher topics that are traditionally not discussed in polite company as we are taught when we're younger.
What's sampling of those third rails?
We obviously there's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also there's anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, or anti-Muslim bigotry, whatever you decide to call it. I'll let Suhail describe it. We set out to talk about anti-Semitism in the Muslim community and Islamophobia in the Jewish community, and see if we could be better allies with each other. So if there's a Jews engaging in anti-Muslim bigotry, that we call them out, and vice versa. What's interesting here, though, is that under the terms of sort of the modern conversation, which is based on sort of this standpoint epistemology, that of lived experience, each community is supposed to be able to define racism against it. And we feel that that's very problematic. We could have, and this is really Suhail and I think, and I speaking, not necessarily the whole group, But if we would have asserted that you must agree that anti-Semitism is exactly as what we say it is, which is, among other things, anti-Zionism, the dialogue would have probably been over. And I think if they would have demanded that we immediately distance ourselves with some of the people who are most Jews, who are most critical of quote unquote Muslim terrorism, we would have also had to leave. So those demands on each other would have made it impossible for us to remain in dialogue with each other. And it's actually because we're not bound by these sort of standpoint differences and claims that we're able to actually continue to engage.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. Not without its controversies, as you can appreciate, but it has been very interesting because we are, taking on some of these much more difficult issues. There has been the good news has been, particularly post 9/11, and for a number of reasons post the Trump election, that the Jewish and the Muslim communities have come together, despite some real trepidations on both communities' parts, to fight discrimination against those respective communities. Because as we know, there has been a rise in hate crimes against both communities. But whereas David pointed out there has been some difficulty is when that animosity is directed from within our communities towards the other. Then it suddenly becomes very uncomfortable to talk about, as David articulated, anti-Semitism within the Muslim American community and anti-Muslim bigotry within the Jewish community, and to not only call that out, but to address those challenges and what we might be able to do about it, starting with our own respective communities. And so we've had those conversations, and oftentimes that includes naming individuals by name and saying, look, this person and what they're saying and what they're doing is very offensive and hurtful, and this is why. And naturally, when one finds somebody within their communities under attack, the natural response is to kind of circle the wagons and become defensive. And that's why this dialogue is so important, to begin that process.
So just the correct amount of internal cancel culture, then.
That's right. That's right.
Right. On one, we actually bring up sort of, I won't call them suits, but we bring up sort of complaints about a figure in one of the other communities. And recently we had one, and I can't go into detail about it precisely because we decided not to go public. But what we decided, instead of making a public issue out of it, we would educate each other's community about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So we've had 2 sessions with the Jewish community with Muslim leaders and voices about Islamophobia and anti-Islamic Muslim bigotry. And I think we're about to have the first one, I think next week, with the Jewish community, with the Muslim community listening to Jewish leaders. So that's the kind of exchange that happens. We didn't actually go the route of trying to cancel the others leaders who spoke out of turn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's unique about these dialogues that we've been having, and in the public-facing dialogues that David referenced, is that our target audience is not kind of the public at large, or even the larger Jewish or Muslim American communities. It's really activists, leaders, civic and political leaders within those communities who, again, in their everyday life, may be working with others, other religious leaders, in their professional and civic capacities, but may harbor questions, doubts, even some stereotypes and animosities towards the other. But again, because of fear of being canceled, because of fear of being called a racist or, anti-Semite or anti-Muslim bigot, they are loath to bring up those questions. For example, one of the big questions that we had from one of our prominent Jewish American friends when it came to Islam and Muslims, they said, well, what about Farrakhan? And this was a very legitimate question, and it wasn't something that was coming from any place of hostility or racism. But, they said, well, Farrakhan has said some pretty hateful things, and he calls himself a black Muslim. What does that mean? And it was interesting not only that he asked that question, but that, and I can tell you from the Muslim interlocutors were like, well, you're asking us that now, but in my own mind, I said, well, I'm glad they're asking it, because clearly it's been on their heart for some time, and they didn't feel they could ask it without being possibly taken as offensive, but they have legitimate questions, and so that was just kind of the first question out of the gate, coming from a person who has very strong ties to the Muslim community, but for whatever reason hadn't had that issue addressed or resolved in their mind.
So these two communities, broadly speaking, the Jewish community and the Muslim community, they have a lot of historical and cultural reason to be against each other. A lot of habits, and there's a lot of history there, dating back to biblical times, literally. So what's some of the primary methods to overstep or to disarm those inherited and historical things that set these communities at odds with one another? What is the primary bridge and the secondary trusses and supports of that?
Yeah. So the communities actually have a lot in common in terms of their religious traditions that we can sort of delve into and explore. In some ways, it's easier to do Muslim-Jewish dialogue on a strictly religious basis than it is Christian-Jewish dialogue. And I don't know if it's the same for Muslims. We have a much more similar cultural heritage and so forth. We're not claiming that they're the same. The Jewish community is both an ethnicity and a nationality and a religious tradition, and that can complicate things. Many of us that are part of a Muslim-Jewish dialogue may not be as inherently religious. I mean, I'm frankly I'm a very committed secular Jew, and sometimes when my Muslim friends talk about God, it's a very different perspective. It's not often talked about in the Jewish community in the same way, at least in the non-Orthodox Jewish community. So there are differences there, but there's a lot to fall back on. Some of the customs are similar. We both have dietary restrictions. For example, we both fast on certain days, Muslims more than Jews. So there's a lot to deal with there. But groups like ours, this is a very high level group we're talking about. So many of us have been through all that, and we know the cultural similarities. So we were able to go to the more challenging issues pretty quickly. And I think that's really, but I wouldn't advise Muslims and Jews who are just getting to know each other to start there. Start by talking about what you have in common and then go to difference. By the way, that's a criticism I would have almost over a lot of diversity training programs as well. I mean, they start with the differences and the tensions rather than, okay, what makes us united? What do we share in common before you talk about differences? And I think, again, that's another thing I would learn from Muslim-Jewish dialogue.
Yeah, I would add to that. My experience was very different from the stereotype, at least, of one of conflict. In that, I grew up as the only non-white kid in Orange County in California in my elementary school, and again, it was my Jewish friends who I felt some community because of what David was articulating. The fact that I couldn't have the pork sausages, that was part of the lunch menu that particular day. And when we went shopping, my mom would load up on the Hebrew National hot dogs. And I grew up with eating a lot of kosher foods, and on airlines back when we used to have full meals on airlines. So I'm showing my age. We would order the kosher meals, because from a Muslim's perspective, kosher food was considered, completely permissible, and so there was a lot of community, a sense of community, even before I even met a Jewish person, just from basic dietary. No kid wants to feel left out, in the cafeteria, and so. My mother was going to college when I was little, and her study partner, happened to be Jewish. And so I, got exposed to some of the different cuisine and the customs and the holidays. And again, being that they were like my holidays, not part of the then predominantly Christian culture, there was a sense of community, and that, hey, we're in this together. We're the two guys that are going to be going to the Chinese restaurant on Christmas Day. So that wasn't. So my experience growing up was one of allyship. It wasn't until I was old enough to begin getting involved in the conversations about Israel and Palestine and other types of issues that suddenly there were rifts that began to form.
Okay.
And that became more loud and pronounced particularly as the Muslim American community began to grow in political and other strengths in the United States, and some within the Jewish community saw that as a threat. And to be fair, many Muslims were very vocal in their criticism, not only of Israel, but then in stating and making very anti-Semitic comments. And so those types of, that type of rhetoric from a few, unfortunately, really served to poison the well of dialogue between the two communities, again, on a much more national level. Person to person, mosque to synagogue on a local level, there's been a history of very good relations. But when it came to institutions and leaders, that's where the conversation began to become poisoned. And that's why we're trying to unravel that animosity today.
So in an ironic way, in the secular field is where the sectarianism kind of starts to rile up, but in the religious field, there's a lot of already a lot of connection going on.
Oh, absolutely. In 2009, I was honored to join with Rabbi Jack Bemperad, in organizing a trip of Muslim American imams to go visit Auschwitz and Dachau. And it was kind of the first of its kind for American Muslim leaders to go make that journey, to visit the place where 6 million Jews were murdered, to speak with survivors and learn of that horrific experience. And even before we left the United States for this trip, I remember the rabbis and the imams were completely lost in these very arcane religious conversations about, the Bible and the Quran and religious injunctions about specific issues. And they were what I would argue as a lawyer, arguing about the number of, angels on a pinhead, but completely in it with a sense of, of religious and dialectical community. They were really just geeking out, if I can use that technical term, on religious doctrine. And I just thought, gosh, if people could just see this, sitting at the Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C., these Talmudic scholars and these Islamic imams discussing arcane religious concepts completely and really enjoying the conversation and learning from one another. Again, it was because it was separate from politics. It was separate from, the more secular and perhaps more mundane challenges that we face day to day. But from a religious perspective, they were completely of one mind.
And with that as kind of the starting point of how you guys are building bridges and how those bridges are being formed and maintained, to what extent or how does critical social justice, as we're going to call it during this talk, how does that do the opposite of building bridges? In what way is that harming or potentially harming this discourse?
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways. One is sort of the straitjacket of standpoint theory, which we talked about, where everybody starts to assert what the prejudice is against their own community. And again, that's sort of a dialogue killer. Like, how can you talk to somebody and really push back against them if you disagree with them when they have the absolute right to define themselves in your eyes? So I think that's one aspect of it, which we think is disastrous. And we really, we've talked about this, really worry about the next generation of young Muslims and Jews who come at it with this idea that they get to tell each other what racism or Islamophobia is without any further discussion. I don't think that that's the way you get to know somebody else. I think that the general culture of sort of victimization is really challenging for us. I know Suhail and I were talking about this before this podcast. We both experienced, and I'll let Suhail describe his own, we both experienced prejudice growing up and in various times of our lives. When I was a kid, especially like a ninth grader in high school, I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism, like coins thrown at my feet and swastikas written in my book and so forth. And yet I never saw myself as oppressed at any point. Maybe I wasn't oppressed. Maybe that's not the same level of oppression that other minorities might face. But still, I think that self-definition didn't make me think of myself as playing that role in American society, as a victim of white supremacy or domination. I think that when you don't carry that burden with you, you're able to engage with others on sort of equal footing. You don't have a claim against anybody, even if you have a claim against somebody. You're just engaging people because it's good to know your neighbor. You know that you're going to build a better society by getting to know your neighbor. And you can have very rich conversations that advance not just relations between you and the other group, but between your group and many other groups that leads to a better civil society.
Yeah, I would add to that a couple of challenges when it comes to some of the straitjackets, as David articulates, of these types of dialogues are just that. Number one, that one person is inherently a bigot or a racist because of their religion or their race. That another person is, by definition, perhaps without saying it, always going to be the victim. And there's that you perpetuate this sense of victimhood in a particular community. I think that really becomes very counterintuitive, counterproductive, and is counterintuitive to the goals of these types of dialogue, which is to bring reconciliation, to bring healing, and to really bring unity, whether it be within the religious communities or in our body politic as a whole. I find that it often exacerbates those divides and those challenges because one group is labeled as inherently or systemically racist. There's no doubt there is systemic racism in our country. There's no doubt that we've had institutions, beginning, of course, with slavery, that are inherently racist. But to label the entire American project as one built, on racism, and as Martin Luther King said, the birth defect of the United States was no doubt slavery. But to define the entire American project by that birth defect, I think, is very destructive. And so we are trying to, as David articulated, get away from pointing fingers at an entire community as being inherently one way or the other, to accentuate and emphasize the commonalities in our communities, and then, where appropriate, where individuals of our community or institutions within our communities have perpetuated stereotyping, hatred, bigotry, to call them out. Not shy away from that, but not with the purpose of saying, look, this is just another example of why you're going to be racist and hateful towards me, in perpetuity, but rather to actually, in a very therapeutic way, to address the challenges, come to some type of resolution. Again, we're not always going to agree. And sometimes we don't agree. The issue, for example, of Zionism is very thorny on both sides of the Jewish-Muslim conversation. But if I would never for a second demand that the Jewish community accept my definition of Zionism, going into the conversation prior to having that conversation, because the idea is not to score political points, but rather to ultimately bring us together as Americans to further the idea of unity and real dialogue and conversation.
I think there's something embedded in your framing of seeking healing and reconciliation that is counter to currents within critical social justice that are taking up a reparation and redress model of power redistribution that then pits everybody up into camps of that kind of zero-sum game in a way of correcting something rather than healing and going forward. So I think that might be a clue, like the end goal, the telos, and the framing is different between these two models.
Right.
That's right.
I've been lurking on some groups on Clubhouse where there's young Jews and young Palestinians coming together talking about issues, and the issue will sometimes be framed as one of justice or peace. There was one recent Clubhouse gathering that I sort of sat in on, and it was fascinating. The Palestinians made very sort of strong assertions about justice, and you felt that many of the younger Jews felt beholden to those assertions, deferential to those assertions. And I had this uncanny feeling the entire time that it wasn't a dialogue. That it was one community that had stronger victim claims than the other. And I don't think it's actually good for either community. I mean, I think it's to be in a discussion like that, I don't think you actually learn. I think you just have one community making its assertions and the other sort of asking a lot of questions and being very deferential, but tiptoeing around some of the issues and not making their own claims. And so I don't think that's the right model for engagement. I just don't think that you actually get anywhere that way. And I doubt that they're going to continue to have these discussions because you're going to go through the same exercise over and over again.
It really does seem like Solomon splitting the baby. That kind of biblical reference for anybody.
Biblical reference, exactly. And even taking it out of the Jewish-Muslim context, the model that I've seen just in my own lifetime is the South African model with Nelson Mandela. By any measure, after he came out of prison and apartheid was finally abolished in South Africa, the Black African population of South Africa, if they were pursuing a strict justice model, there would have been, a revolution, a bloody revolution in South Africa, and I would dare to say justice probably would not have been served in the long term of South Africa's future, particularly when you compare it to what happened in neighboring Zimbabwe. But there, Nelson Mandela, in his wisdom, despite his long imprisonment, sought to have what he called, of course, was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which again called out the horrors of the apartheid regime, but without that eye for an eye justice, called for justice that in the end, again, does not result in the ultimate healing of the nation. So I thought that, that was very instructive to me, that yes, you can be, like you said, Benjamin, you can be Solomon and just divide the baby. But in the end, whose purpose does that serve? And probably neither community's purpose.
Mm-hmm.
There's another element that I think is problematic with it. While critical social justice is supposedly designed to protect minorities against the dominant majority, I think it actually, at least for Jews, leads the opposite direction. I think it, one, creates a permission structure for anti-Semitism. Once you're allowed to talk about a hierarchy of privileges, it's not such a leap to talk about Jewish privilege, which we've heard over and over again already. And that sounds an awful lot like the typical anti-Semitic trope on the right. So that's one. Two, it'll disenfranchise a lot of Jews over time who feel more comfortable on the left in the Democratic Party. I mean, it'll become increasingly hostile for sort of mainstream Jews to be part of a party that buys into this ideology wholesale and is that intersectional in nature. And I think third, and maybe most, Jews have done very, very well under liberalism. Liberal countries with rational discourse have provided a measure of stability for Jewish life that has allowed us to thrive. And I worry that when you have irrationalism on the right, which you do, and you have irrationalism on the left, which you do, that's going to be profoundly destabilizing, and that's not good for the Jews, as we like to say.
Suhail, would you mind adding to that with how you think or your perception on the Muslim community faring under liberal Western democracy, how that's been for that community and how it's going? And
sure, it's a thoughtful question. I'll say it's complicated. The American Muslim community, of course, it's not a community; it's communities. There's roughly 6+ million American Muslims in the country. There, a Muslim American living in, rural Texas is very different from a Muslim living in downtown Chicago. Their life experience is going to be very different. But generally speaking, if you look at the makeup of the Muslim American community, with being roughly 1/3 African American, communities that have been here since the very founding of our nation, and then the other 2/3 being roughly 2/3 being of an immigrant experience, like my parents who immigrated to Wyoming in the mid '60s. The experience, speaking on that, for that community, the immigrant experience, I'll say, is one of opportunity, one that, as my parents always said, they chose to come to the United States. Fleeing oppression, fleeing discrimination. In my father's case, he had an opportunity to go to the Soviet Union. He declined that opportunity because it was, at the time, a communist, atheist country. But when he had an opportunity to come to Laramie, Wyoming in 1966, he seized on that opportunity because, as his father said, I don't know much about the United States, but it is a God-fearing country. And so he made that journey the first time that he ever, got on a plane. And so there was a sense of optimism, of hope, of, America is not perfect, and it certainly wasn't in 1966, but it was a country that was working to for perfection, working to improve institutions, including for minorities, African Americans, and other recent immigrants. And so there was that aspirational ethos within people like my father, my mother, and the millions of others who have chosen to make America their home. Mm-hmm. So that is definitely part of the American Muslim community. I grew up with that ethos, but what I do find in recent years with, even members of my own family, with American-born Muslims who don't have that immigrant experience. I'm talking about the children and the grandchildren of immigrants. They are embracing what they are learning on college campuses, which is, again, that the American project is one based on racism, on exploitation. It is not one of opportunity, but rather one of systemic exploitation, racism, etc. And so then it becomes a feeling that, well, and you as a Muslim and a person of color are a victim, and thereby never going to be given a fair shake in this society because it's based on irreparably racist and xenophobic institutions and a platform that will never provide you justice, etc. And so that I find, again, very destructive, very hurtful. It causes a suspicion about government institutions, about our democracy, at its very best. And I was talking to a friend the other day, an older Catholic gentleman who said, I never felt I've never felt fully American as a Catholic until John F. Kennedy was elected in 1960. And I thought that was very profound. When I came to Capitol Hill over 26 years ago as the only Muslim American staffer on Capitol Hill, I definitely predicted, having seen the institution function, that there would be a day that there would be American Muslims holding a congressional office. And to me, the sign of a healthy Muslim American community, and one that was part of the American fabric, was that you would have American Muslims who would be facing off on opposite sides of a given issue on the House floor. And we're not quite there yet. We have 3 Muslim American members of Congress. They're largely on one side of the political aisle. But they do differ even in their viewpoints on issues. And to me, that's not a sign of disunity. That's a sign of, again, as David points out, the liberalism in a healthy way of the American project. And so to me, that's an optimism that's inherent within the community. The African-American Muslim community has a different experience because of their being African-American. But again, with the election of Barack Obama, to use the example of my Catholic friend, I'm hard-pressed to see another country in the world where a person who is systemically oppressed can rise in a democratic manner to be elected popularly, not once but twice, against white Anglo-Saxon males, and by a popular election. To me, that's a sign of progress, of growth, and the exceptionalism of the American project.
There is, well, I'm I guess culturally and I was raised a Christian, and so we're kind of all children of Abraham, to borrow a term, to different degrees. The history of the evolution of the concept of justice is principal, very central to all 3 of our traditions. And there's something about critical social justice that seems to be a reversion from that, or a toppling of certain evolutionary steps that got us to a place where we kind of expect disagreement, and to use disagreement to get to some sort of agreement and some sort of platform after things are resolved. I'm just that's just kind of something that's coming up for me, like the principle of justice, and what is that, and how is that a core to all 3 of our cultures, and how is that kind of under assault or being dismantled right now?
Right. So one thing that comes to mind for me is the whole harm versus intent morality that I think flies in the face of at least Jewish tradition. There, if you read about various Talmudic scenarios of these are very often very detailed ethical scenarios in which your ox is gored by somebody else's ox, and what do you do about it? It's always infused with a sense of what was the intent of the actor. Was it negligence? Did they take steps to prevent your ox from being gored? That, to me, is a foundation of our current legal and moral system and understanding. And once you say, well, intent doesn't matter, it's just harm, which we're hearing now. And first of all, I don't understand how that scales in society. Imagine a society where people could just claim that they were harmed emotionally, and therefore they should punishment should be meted out. I don't know what that looks like and what that means, and why anybody thinks that that's a good idea. But that's part of what's under assault here, is this very idea. I mean, people are saying explicitly that asserting intent is a function of white privilege, which to me is absurd. And I don't know how you have a society that doesn't have some notion of intent, that has both sort of deontological morality and consequentialist morality working together in some ways. And we're losing that in this current critical social justice conversation. And I think that's one area where those of us who believe in the liberal project really have to fight back and explain why that's completely nonsensical. But it certainly emerges out of our religious traditions as well. There's nothing remotely Jewish about saying that just harm matters and that your intent doesn't matter. You can't even make sense of half the crimes in Jewish law when you don't talk about intent. How is it that you have murder versus accidentally killing somebody because you made a mistake. I mean, obviously it's horrific either way, but the person is not guilty in any way, shape, or form of the same crime. So I think we need to start asking ourselves how people with these traditional moral sensibilities can say, well, what is your plan for running the society based on that?
Mm-hmm. And Suhail, are there any lessons that we can draw from Islamic law and tradition about what we do with the victim, what we do with redress, what we do around the concept of justice and the proper running of a society in which harm happens and dealing with harm?
There are many examples of that. One that came to mind, bringing it right to the heart of the matter of the conflict in the Middle East is, when the Caliph, Omar, conquered Jerusalem and was invited by the Christians of Jerusalem to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is considered, one of the more holy places in all of Christendom. He declined, not because of any, dislike for the Christian church, but because he didn't want to give, even as a conquering general, did not want to give future generations of Muslims who would be living in that area an excuse to somehow convert the church into a mosque or to lay claim to the church because he, as the leader of the Muslim armies and of the Muslim nation state, had prayed in that particular location. And we know, of course, there were other examples where churches were converted into mosques. And so I'm not saying that didn't happen. The Hagia Sophia in Constantinople is another example of that. But he, in that instance, I thought showed great wisdom, that even though as a conquering general he had every right, and in that instance was not only every right, but was invited to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he had the wisdom to decline because of an interest for the Christian population in Jerusalem, and to set a precedent that Islamically, from an Islamic doctrine perspective, places of worship are to be protected under Muslim rule. Again, that has not always been the practice, and I always caution both my Muslim and my non-Muslim friends that don't judge Islam by the practice of Muslims, just as I wouldn't any other faith, but judge it by the actual doctrine itself. In this instance, I would argue that he demonstrated great wisdom. In going even back a few years before that, the Prophet Muhammad was married several times. He married a Jewish woman, Sophia, and she converted from Judaism to Islam. But when he invited a Christian king from now modern-day Ethiopia, which is then called Abyssinia, to Islam, the Christian king declined and said, "Thanks, but no thanks. I'm good being Christian, but I appreciate your offer. But as a token of good respect and good gesture, I'm going to send you a slave girl as a gift." And he sent a Christian girl, Maria Coptia. Maria, of course, the traditional Christian name, Coptia. She was a Copt Christian, as a gift. And the Prophet Muhammad married her rather than keeping her as a slave. And she remained a Christian. She did not convert to Islam. So I just use these as examples where, in religious practice and in doctrine, there are examples where magnanimity, graciousness, and forethought were demonstrated that, will hopefully to some degree offset many of the horrors that have been practiced by many in the name of their faith, but I would argue contrary to their religious teachings.
I think that it's possible to superimpose that what you were just saying with identity, just swapping out religion with identity, where identity, all these different identities, be it cultural identity or racial identity, etc., can be there's something to be respected about that, where that is held to be something that you are and that I'm not going to violate, and that we're going to get along despite the differences on any given level in that way. And I was just, you guys were making me think about the way in which over history, commerce is how these different religions kind of figured out how to get along. Just the marketplace and trading in a non-ideological way, where we're just I have a good, you have a good, and exchanging value. And I just wonder if that's if we're missing some sort of non-ideological marketplace at this point, because so much of our mind space is kind of taken, so much of our relationship across differences has become an ideological kind of spat and back and forth, and there's really no neutral ground on Twitter. It's all war all the time in a way.
Right. And I worry a lot about this, that in some sense, it's shrinking diversity in the name of diversity. That if you actually look at how rich the diversity of relationships are, how different countries over many years, centuries sometimes, have actually had quite good relationships among various ethnic and religious communities, and how they thought about it, we're imposing this very narrow model of sort of intersectionalism on all these relationships, and it makes no sense. The other day there was a young person who completely disagrees about everything I'm arguing now, sent me this wheel of intersectionalism. And at the top, there was privilege. So if you were part of the groups at top, you were privileged. In the center, there was domination. So if you were below the domination line, you were being dominated by somebody of privilege. And at the very bottom was oppression. And all these groups were listed along the perimeter of this wheel. And I thought to myself, I mean, imagine that, like, if that had been the model of intergroup relations in these countries, that would never have worked. I don't think it will work in our society at all. And it completely claims to supersede every great thing that we've ever done in connecting with each other as human beings or as identities or as other communities. I think that's really sad. A colleague of mine recently told a story. This is a colleague who's known for her opposition to critical social justice. Told the story that a Nigerian professor came to her and asked for her help in trying to integrate into the new, very woke environment on the campus. This is somebody from Nigeria who has perhaps some heterodox views that wouldn't easily fit into the woke atmosphere among other academics, is getting woke lessons from somebody who's anti-woke, which is an incredible irony. But if you actually stop and pause for a second and think about it, it just shows you the absurdity of the model, that this person is potentially worried about being blackballed by the mostly white academics for not easily fitting into their ideology. And that person happens to be Nigerian. So I just think that that we're actually losing something in that's been built over hundreds of years of how groups can interact with each other, and in trying to fit them into this ideological mold.
It's a reversion of justice, and it's also a reversion of back to it's an odd sort of fundamentalism that says it's going to supersede all previous fundamentalism in some really sneaky way.
Right.
But what's so pernicious about it is that it hurts the very communities that it at least claims to protect. To over 25 years ago, when I was in law school, I had a very good friend who was in my class, an African American woman from Chicago, who I was not the top of our class. And for those, who have attended law school, they'll know you're constantly ranked in law school. So you know exactly where you are in the pecking order as far as your academic performance. And she was either number one or number two in a class of 225. She was a University of Chicago undergrad. Brilliant individual. And one day when I was on my way out from the library to go, waste time doing whatever, and she was staying studying, I saw that she was crying. And so I asked, if there's anything I could do. And she just said, oh, I'm just under a lot of pressure and I feel so alone. And I asked why. And she said, as a black student at this school, and the school was, predominantly white, she said, I feel that I'm being told by my fellow black students that because of my rank, like I said, number one or number two in the class, that she was trying to be white. And the white students were ostracizing her because they assumed that she had gotten in under a race-based affirmative action program, and that she was somehow being coddled as a student, and that her academic performance was somehow because somebody was putting the thumb on the scale to help her out, which of course was not the case. She was working hard and very much different from what I was doing. And I just thought to myself in that moment, gosh, something is just really wrong here, that a person who is doing very well, working hard, putting in the time, who happens to be a black woman, is being ostracized by both the minority and the dominant community for different reasons, both completely wrong and, based on complete falsehoods. But the tragedy and the victim of this is the individual themselves, who, at least, by the university standards, they are seeking to protect and to help, but they're falling between these cracks, and it was something that just broke my heart.
There's a way in which, to draw on Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's coddling of the American mind, where they lay out that there's common enemy politics and common humanity politics, and to take that and to expand on it, there's a politicking or a way of getting along where we have a common enemy, and then there's a way of getting along where we have a common project to do, common preservation. And it seems like, not to be Western imperialist, colonialist oppressor or supremacist, it seems like liberal democracy might be something that it would be good for all of us to preserve. And because it preserves our difference and it allows us to express our differences and then to mediate those differences into something productive. And that project of preserving that, just the mode of communicating across difference, might be what allows us to maintain that difference and also escape what is pushing us towards back into a fighting and all contentious power play between all these different groups, or forcing that conflict and that animosity onto a common goal, be it like the colonialist state of America, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a proposition. Do you guys have any hope or bridges that you see for keeping that as a goal, or reinstituting that in the dialogue that is now suffering under the creeping, pernicious, critical social justice thing that we've been describing?
Yeah, so I would say that when Suhail and I wrote a joint op-ed, we're on this podcast together. We're not even talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're talking about how to preserve American democracy and liberalism, and I do think that there's a lot of possibility there. I worry it's become more generational. The generational divide is much bigger than the Muslim-Jewish divide. That the difference between myself and a 25-year-old Jewish person might be much greater in a lot of ways, certainly culturally, intellectually, than it is with Suhail. Suhail and I understand. I mean, also, my mom happens to be an immigrant too, came to the United States from Baghdad, Iraq in 1963. I probably grew up very similarly to Suhail in that way, even some of the, international flavors. And And yet, so I think there's a lot to build on there. And I would love to work with Suhail and others on building sort of a multiracial coalition for liberalism and liberal democracy. And I hope we can work on that.
I think I am optimistic in the long term because I've seen the resiliency of the American project. My experience has been working in the political arena for the last 30 years, including here in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned, working in Congress and then in the executive branch. I have seen at its toughest, the American project is one of resilience, of reinvention, of inclusion. It's not that we're perfect. It's not that we get it right every time. Often, as Churchill said, you can count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other opportunities or possibilities. And that's sometimes true. We have to, screw up once or twice before we get it right. But the model and the history and the tradition is that we do strive to get it right, that there is an effort to get it right. And unlike other models around the globe, ours is not based on a particular ethnic or religious or racial identity. Yes, there are some who would like to associate it with a particular race or religion, etc. But generally, the American project is free of those hang-ups, and that is demonstrated by the very fabric of our country every day. And so I'm optimistic in the long term, but I am cautious about the short-term realities, because there are some, including those who are, proposing these type of critical race theory ideas, that do pit one religious or racial group against another, and that rather than seeking the unique nature of the American project, of the Constitution, with including its challenges, but that's what the amendment process is all about. That they are seeking to emphasize the negative, the victimhood, as David articulated with that wheel, the one taking advantage of the other, and that I think is a challenge that could hobble our continued growth and opportunity, which I'm very confident. Because of the institutions established in the Constitution, because of the spirit of everyday Americans, I have no worry that we will continue to prevail and continue to grow. But will that happen in a timely manner? Will that happen in one generation or in several? That is at doubt when we have these very prevalent theories that are taking root not only on college campuses but increasingly in corporate America and other larger institutions, that perhaps out of being guilted or bullied into these, or wholesale adopting these types of theories, even again with the best of intentions, will only exacerbate challenges and differences that we might have in our country, rather than bringing us together.
Yeah, Washington State has they're just about to mandate mandatory CRT, diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racist training, K through higher ed, for all students and all teachers, with tests directly afterwards to see if they absorb these ideas. So,
while several other states, red states, are banning it altogether, it's an interesting dynamic where you're seeing it go in both directions. I'm a little less optimistic than Suhail. Maybe I'll go with 60-40 optimistic to pessimistic. I'm optimistic by nature, and I think America has every reason to generate optimism and shows great resilience through the ages. But I worry that the process of social learning has come to, I won't say a halt, but has slowed significantly. That the cycles of learning from election defeat, for example, I'm not sure are happening in the same way that they used to. It used to be that when Republicans lost an election, they gravitate toward the center. I'm not sure that's going to happen. It used to be when Democrats lost an election, or when they lost ground, let's say in the House of Representatives, they gravitated toward the center. I don't think that that's happening anymore, because I think both parties, both wings, have been captured by ideological fanatics that are more powerful than any kind of learning allows. And so I worry a lot that process that has allowed us to grow over time, even after getting things wrong, may not be working in the way that it used to, and that we could be in a very, very dangerous area where in 10 years from now, either things are going to be much, much better because we have figured it out, and the forces of resilience and unity have overcome the forces of division, or we could be much, much worse off than we are now. And so I'm going to go with 60-40 with Suhail, but I'm much less confident and faithful, perhaps. Maybe that's a sign that I'm Jewish and given towards disbelief in some ways.
I let you say that. I didn't point that out, David.
Right, you let me say that, right? But anyway, I'm concerned about these sort of centrifugal forces unleashed in American society now.
There's certainly a lot of work to do. There's certainly a lot of conversations to have and to continue having. And on that note, what are you guys up to outside of this podcast and your op-ed? What projects are you doing, and what resources can we turn people on to?
Well, as David articulated, we definitely, the project of dialogue between the Jewish and Muslim community that we mentioned is hosting a webinar next week by prominent Jewish American leaders for a predominantly Muslim American audience to kind of ask anything and discuss anything, even the tough questions. So we're going to continue in that effort. And then beyond that, we are endeavoring to address some of the challenges, because our membership is made primarily of leaders, both in the political and civic arena, to engage in some issues of religious discrimination globally, including what's happening to the Uyghurs in China, and where American leadership and joining with international partners might be asserted to help a besieged religious minority in that country. So these are some of the projects that we're engaged in at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously I'm involved in those projects as well. But in addition to that, I'm very involved in supporting liberalism and opposing the imposition of critical social justice. I'm an affiliate with Counterweight, which is a UK-based nonprofit that you're familiar with, Benjamin, that opposes the imposition of critical social justice. And I've done a lot of writing and work with Counterweight. I'm starting with my partner, Alana Redstone, a firm called Viewpoint Worldwide, which works on diversity at the corporate level, which introduces the idea of viewpoint diversity for corporations that might neutralize some of the more pernicious aspects of ideological diversity. And a third thing I'm working on now is what I think is going to be called the Institute, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which is going to try to fight for liberalism within the Jewish community. I'm under talks with some foundations and others to really establish this. The American Jewish community is important. It plays a central role in the discourse of the country. And if it's losing ground on liberalism, I fear that that's going to have a major impact on the rest of the country. So I'm going to be fighting very hard for liberalism within the Jewish community.
Sounds fun.
That's fun. It's not for everybody, Benjamin. Being smeared in public and on Twitter, I know you're used to it, but it's not for everybody.
It's a lot of talking. That's for sure. Well, gentlemen, this has been a fabulous conversation, very expansive for me, and thank you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to poke your brains with my questions.
Thanks for having us.
Really enjoyed it.
So I'll end the recording there. And
Great.
congratulations for reaching the end of the discussion. If you enjoyed it, do be sure to leave a review or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever you need to do to show that glorious algorithm that this is some good stuff. And do be sure to go and check that back catalog, as it is brimming full of fantastic conversations. Links to provide monetary support are down there in the description as well. Have a good night.